To be mindful of time and people who have to leave at 1. I want to welcome everybody and thank you all for coming. As is either traditional or should be traditional, I would like to acknowledge ACU. What is ACU? Those are the people who inhabited this land before we arrived. Some of us in the proverbial we. That would be the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Southern Ute. But being somewhat animistic, there were animals here before there were people. Wild camels, mammoths. And before that, we can go far deeper to dinosaurs, and we can go far deeper. That's all I will say at this point. I would like to welcome Katie Laverty, Helen Laverty, and Joe Laverty. They have never been to Colorado, but they're here with us today. Thank you for coming. But we are here for Teresa, and I want to reflect a little bit. The first time that I talked with Teresa, I had a call from somebody in Uganda, and it was her. And we chatted, and it's a little difficult to hear her, but she, hi Vincent. And it was a pleasant conversation, and I asked what she was doing. And she had been in Kenya previously, but found Kenya too tame. And so she went to places that were further out, had Afro-montane forests, and she was studying gorillas. Since then, she's traded those forests and goes to one of the most remote deserts in the world, which she will talk about today. So instead of trees, she's got little tiny vegetation. In terms of Teresa's background, she went to Princeton as an undergraduate. She received subsequently an NSF fellowship. She spent a number of years in the Berger Lab at the University of Montana, and then transferred and came here to CSU. Oftentimes I ask people to share something with me that I don't know about them, or what the audience doesn't know about them, and maybe what they would like to be shared, and maybe what they would not like to be shared. And so here's something I learned about Teresa last night when I went out to dinner with Joe, Helen, and Katie. They told me when Teresa was in middle school, she had an anole, a small little lizard, as a pet. And at some point she went to grab it and the tail came off and she was freaked out and she started crying. And she was not going to go into anything with animals. And since then, she's published on caiman, which is a big alligator from Peru, where she had done field work, other parts of Latin America, including Colombia and Panama. And Teresa has also spent time in the Sonoran Desert, Chihuahuan Desert, and in the Northern Rockies. But one of the things that most impresses me about Teresa is not that she will only delve into a project, but she transcends and goes from concept to theory to practice. And so I feel very comfortable today introducing Teresa Laverty.
Thanks, Joel, and thank you guys all for coming, particularly on a nice afternoon. I'm excited to talk to you today about work I've been doing for the last 6 years, first at University of Montana, which I then continued when I moved here to Colorado State. So one of the fundamental topics that we try to address in ecology is an understanding of the abundance and distributions of species across the landscape. And this is in relation to both other species and abiotic factors like temperature or precipitation. And we can think about this on many scales, whether it's a continental scale, as you're seeing the distribution of brown bears across the northern hemisphere here, or at a more localized scale within a mountain range, for instance, where differences in elevation correspond to different habitats, and that relates to different species. Or at an even finer scale. MacArthur's famous work in southern New Jersey, near my hometown of Ocean City, found that 5 different warbler species are able to coexist within the same pine tree. And as ecologists, most of what we model for species distributions relies heavily on abiotic factors, which include rainfall and precipitation, rainfall and temperature. In Colorado, this is very well studied, particularly for cold water fish systems. What you're seeing here is West Slope cutthroat trout. And we know that at very high temperatures, this species will not exist and is highly dependent on cold water systems. However, biotic interactions or species interactions are known to matter as well. And this was studied quite intensively by Connell, looking at barnacle species in the intertidal zone. And when these two species coexist, their distributions look something like this. However, in isolation, we know that Thamylus is able to extend to the lower portions of the intertidal zone and is said to be competitively excluded by Balanus from these lower reaches when they exist together. However, Balanus is abiotically limited from extending further upwards as it desiccates at those higher reaches. And while we study a lot about abiotic and biotic factors in determining species distributions, we know that we as humans also heavily impact where species are found on the landscape. And this recent study in Global Change Biology highlighted the range sizes of about 49,000 terrestrial mammals, 4,900 terrestrial mammals, and found that human population densities and distance to major cities was a major predictor and a better predictor than some of the other biological traits they measured. But of course, these abiotic, biotic, and human factors or social factors can all interact. And those abiotic and biotic factors were somewhat debated by Darwin and Wallace in their works. And it was Darwin who said that not until we reach the extreme confines of life, in the arid regions or on the borders of an utter desert, will competition cease. The land may be extremely cold or dry, yet there will be competition between some few species or between the individuals of the same species for the warmest or dampest spots. And so what I think Darwin was trying to say here is that in extreme environments, abiotic factors really determine where we find species. However, around limiting resources, there may be some biotic interactions. And the strength of these two components is what I'm debating here today. And I'm focusing also in an extreme environment. 17% of our land area is covered by deserts. These are characterized by a highly low annual rainfall on average from year to year. However, this rainfall is also highly variable when it does come. So this map is showing the coefficient of variation, a measure of variation in the amount of rainfall that the Earth receives each year. And you can see that the highest variation, these dark colors, highly overlay the map of deserts. The desert that I'm going to be focusing on today is the Namib Desert. It ranges from southern Angola to northern South Africa along the Atlantic coast. It's considered to be one of the world's oldest deserts, being no more wet than semi-arid for the last 80 million years. Namibia is about twice the size of California, with 1/16 of its population at about 2.5 million people. It's one of the least densely populated countries in the world. However, it is a recent country and includes biodiversity conservation in its constitution. The study region that I'm focusing on is in the northwest portion of the country between Skeleton Coast National Park on the Atlantic coast and Etosha National Park by that big pan up there. And this area that I was covering is about 9,500 square miles, or roughly the size of Vermont. And when most people think of the Namib Desert, they think of a scene like this. These standing dead trees in areas where 1,000 years ago there used to be water, among some of the world's tallest sand dunes. However, my study area further north, the sand dunes kind of transform into these gravel plains. And it's in this region that we have the highest biodiversity that we find in the Namib Desert. Resources in deserts are not equally distributed across the landscape, and rivers really function as hotspots for life and are important in structuring desert communities. It's in these areas that vegetation productivity really concentrates, and for that reason, many species dependent on vegetation and water also really concentrate in these systems. However, you may have noticed that these rivers are highly ephemeral. They're lucky if they sustain above ground flows 10 to 20 days per year. And when the water does come, it brings with it nutrients and insect blooms, migratory birds, and can really vastly affect not only the number of animals on the landscape, but also how they're distributed. The more permanent forms of water on the landscape include natural springs that are located within the river channels, and artificial pools. These are man-made pools constructed just outside of river channels for the purpose of wildlife or livestock consumption. And what I want you to take away from this is that these water sources, particularly in the hottest, driest times of the year, really act to concentrate wildlife. And so when we typically think of deserts, we do not usually think of a very diverse system with a lot of animals. However, close to these limiting bodies of water, they do really function as biodiversity hotspots with higher concentrations of wildlife. And this is true not just for diurnal animals, but also nocturnal animals. And so an insect-eating bat, quite small, can lose 10 to 30% of its water weight each day just by desiccation. And so one of the first things bats tend to do when they wake up is to come down and take a drink. They also tend to concentrate around bodies of water because in these areas there's typically more insects. And I just want to point out that 1 in every 5 mammal species is a bat. So if we're interested in looking at how species react to a variety of factors or respond to a variety of factors, having a large suite of all insect-eating bats can be pretty beneficial to study. So I've talked about how water really acts to concentrate biodiversity in this landscape. It also acts to concentrate people and their livestock. And so what I will be addressing today are how do abiotic and biotic factors influence insect-eating bat communities. And because as conservation biologists, we're not just interested in the ecology of a system, I also want to ask what are the social kind of factors influencing how people perceive and tolerate living with wildlife in this system. And I may have somewhat hinted already that we expect strong differences between dry and wet seasons in this region, and so I'll be asking if there's any seasonal effects for each of these questions. So I first want to start with how does water affect insectivorous bat communities? And I've already said that water is a highly limiting factor in desert environments. However, it's important to note that not all water is the same, and that water quality or chemistry can really vary between different bodies of water. And this is significant because people in this area are also highly dependent on these natural springs. It's not uncommon for their sources of water, the pumps, to break, and for months they may be collecting water from the exact same springs that elephants and livestock are watering from. A hole like this, surrounded with salt, highly highly saline environment is not one that you or I would want to be drinking from. So I was interested in how do these water differences across the landscape affect bat communities. And so if water quality is driving bat distributions, as has been found in other studies in the Ngeve Desert and even here in Colorado, I expect that there may be higher bat activity and species richness, or the number of species at a site, at areas with higher quality water. And to first examine the differences in water quality across the landscape, I collected 1 or 1.5 liters of water to send in for laboratory analysis during the end of the dry season and the end of the wet season. So when water is most concentrated and when it's more readily available. I measured a whole suite of concentrations of different minerals and ions. But what I want you to focus on is that poorer quality water is typically associated with higher concentrations of these indices. So to give you an idea of my sampling, I had 23 different bodies of water that I sampled once at the end of the dry season and again once at the end of the wet season for a total of 46 nights of collection. I first asked whether there were any water quality differences between seasons or between artificial pools and natural springs. And in short, I did not find any differences here. However, there were differences across sites, and so I conducted a PCA. It's a form of ordination, and all I want you to take away from this is if there's any clumping of symbols, this represents there may be differences due to this factor. And so I also looked at whether there may be any spatial differences in this landscape. The river catchments up here, Huab to Waneb, are listed from the southernmost river to the northernmost river. And you can kind of see that these green triangles of the Huab River tend to be separated from the red circles of the Waneb River. And those middle rivers tend to overlap quite a bit more. So I took this as a sign to say that there may be some spatial differences due to the underlying groundwater quality or geology of the system. However, these were factors that I didn't measure explicitly. So there are pretty strong differences in water quality across the system. So then I asked, how do bat communities relate to water quality? To look at bat communities, I conducted acoustic sampling with bat detectors. One's pictured here. And these are an instrument that allows us to record the ultrasonic echolocation calls of bats. And when you process the data, you can see calls that look something like this in a software program geared to analyze these. And what's important to note is that different bat species tend to have different call shapes, whether it's duration or frequency or bandwidth. And so we're able to identify bats to the species level using these ultrasonic calls. So from a collection of data that look something like this, we're able to look at bat activity over time. This example is showing 4 different bat species, 2 very active just after sunset, and 2 less active that peak at different times in the night. And we're looking at bat activity rather than bat abundance here, because this may be one bat that's flying back and forth across the microphone, or it may be a whole suite of bats flying by just once. However, where there's more bat activity, in general, it's thought to be a better site for that species or for bats as a whole. Since very little work has been done on bats in this region, very little work, I also went out and conducted some mist netting. I captured about 1,500 bats over a year and a half of working in this system, and was able to acoustically record bats as I released them into the air. And this was a way for me to check my call identifications for different species. And there are many benefits to conducting non-invasive studies. But I just want to point out that while we were mist netting and present at the site, many species would not visit water holes. These are 3 species that would visit whether or not we were there. However, zebra and springbok, for instance, would often hang off to the sides and may abandon their efforts to drink. Animals tend to be more active at night, and so as a way to respect their attempts to visit water holes, we oftentimes would try to record bats throughout the night rather than capture them more than 3 hours. And to give you an idea of the types of diversity that we have in this system, it included miniopterids, rhinolophids, hippocyterids, vesper bats, molluskids, basically big ears, small ears, funny noses, but all these species here are insect-eating bats, and a couple endemics to the Namib Desert. We also captured fruit bats. I will not be talking about these today because these species do not emit echolocation calls, but if you're interested, they do exist around some water holes in the desert system. So from those 46 nights of sampling, 23 in the dry season and 23 in the wet season, that was paired with water sampling, we recorded just over 120,000 bat passes, which included 16 different species. This plot here is summing up a species richness, or the total number of species on the y-axis for different seasons. On the x-axis, dry and wet. In blue, we have artificial pools, and in orange, we have natural springs. And what you can gather from this is that natural springs across both seasons harbor a higher species richness. However, when we look at the mean activity per night or per site, and you're looking at mean activity with the standard deviation across the same seasons, dry and wet, artificial pools, and natural springs, you can see that activity was almost always twice that at artificial pools than natural springs, and that this greatly increased in the wet season. But I want you to note that 6 species were only recorded at natural springs, and this may be due to water quality, or it may be due to a variety of other factors like roosting habitat or the type of vegetation around sites. And so there may be some sort of characteristics associated with these sites that may be impacting species distributions. To look at bats and water quality, we conducted non-metric multi-dimensional scaling, another form of ordination with an environmental fit component to look at how water quality overlays this ordination plot. I found that 4 species were nearly ubiquitous, and so these species do not seem to be relating to water quality in any way. They also tend to be the most captured bats on this landscape. 4 species were associated with higher concentrations of salt, calcium, potassium, and strontium. These all kind of highly correlated with one another, so it's unsurprising that they all show up together. And this was during the wet season when we were also doing heavy metal sampling. So I want you to remind you that these higher concentrations typically indicate poor quality water. So these species either are not affected by water quality or may be competitively excluded from sites that may have better water quality. However, a few other species seem to be less tolerant and were found at lower concentrations of all these different ions. So to wrap up this part of my research, water quality differences do exist across this landscape. However, it's not due to seasonal effects or differences between natural springs and artificial pools. And certain species appear to be reliant on different water features, whether this is the presence of natural springs or specific components of water quality. This is still kind of to be debated in some ways. I basically did one of the first studies looking at any of these kind of effects in this region in Africa. And so ideally, I'd be able to go back in years to come and kind of follow up on this work. So now I'm shifting gears from abiotic factors determining bat distributions to biotic factors. How do other species interact and affect bat distributions through food webs? So to remind you, species really concentrate around water holes and desert systems. And this is very true for herbivores that are highly dependent on the vegetation in these river systems as well. Herbivores have larger effects on vegetation closer to water than they do further from water, and this is known as the biosphere effect. And so I was interested in how these interactions with having differences in vegetation structure and species around water may be influencing other species. And this is what originally got me interested in working in this system. Some of the major herbivore species in this system include black rhinoceros, African elephants, Angolan giraffe, and a whole suite of other smaller herbivores as well as livestock. And this probably is one of the most intact herbivore communities in a desert system, particularly including mega herbivores that we have in the world. So typically when we think of food webs, we think of carnivores impacting prey species, and this may be having several other indirect effects on other species. Similarly, Payne found that there may be a lot of indirect effects with large herbivores whose large body sizes and energy requirements have drastic effects on the amount of vegetation in a landscape. And this may be having indirect effects on other species. And this is very relevant in the sense that many of our world's largest herbivores are in decline across the landscape. And so if we're interested in how some of these mega herbivores in particular are influencing or structuring species communities, then we'd want to study some of these more intact systems. So the general food web that I'm interested here is how are herbivores affecting vegetation in areas close to water. And many other studies have shown that insect abundance and diversity tends to increase with vegetation productivity in other savanna ecosystems in Africa. So have done studies looking at elephants' effects on insect communities. So I'm wondering, how does this play out in this desert system? And how does this relate to the insectivore communities, particularly bats, that are dependent on these species? So this figure here represents a very simplified food web. Not all arrows are drawn, but this is the general system that I'm interested in working with. We know that many of these large herbivores are able to not only reduce the amount of vegetation on the landscape, but also change its 3D structure or vertical distribution. Elephants are known to pull down branches and debark trees that sometimes will kill them. This may be opening up or closing habitat for less maneuverable bat species, among other animals. This region is also home to the world's largest free-ranging population of black rhinos. And these tend to dominate the sub-river channels in this system and may be having drastic effects on vegetation around water. And as I mentioned before, there's also a healthy population of Angolan giraffe whose height alone allows them to browse from quite a large diversity of heights and vegetation. And so This may also be helping to structure the 3D structure of vegetation. However, I would assume that this is less so than the elephants that are able to actually bring down branches as well. So to look at herbivore activity on the landscape, I set up a series of dung transects. So around a body of water, I set up 3 different transect lines, roughly 120 degrees apart, that were 120 meters in length. And I would look to 2 meters to the left and right of me as I'd walk these transect lines each month. I would identify, count, and remove all dung piles, but for the purpose of this study, I'm only focusing on mega herbivore communities and the effects of mega herbivores in this landscape. I was also interested in vegetation productivity, which I measured using the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI, for both the wet and dry seasons that I had mentioned earlier. I calculated the median value with a lot of help thanks to Vincent and Google Earth Engine, and then would calculate the mean NDVI within a 1 kilometer buffer around each body of water. And basically, this is a form of remote sensing using satellite data. So these were not data that I collected on the ground. But what you're seeing in this map here is NDVI values where darker green indicates higher productivity. And I'll toggle through the dry season and wet season a few times so you can see those differences. What I want you to also recognize is that some of that green vegetation does really concentrate in river systems, as I had predicted earlier. So to go further with this food web, I'm really interested in how do mega herbivores relate to vegetation productivity, and how does that in turn relate to the insectivore communities. I didn't have enough data on insects to proceed to add that link in here. However, it's been shown previously that these have strong effects with vegetation productivity. And all of my sites are centered around bodies of water. And to analyze these relationships, I use structural equation modeling. It's a form of path analysis which allows you to look at how these different variables react simultaneously rather than using different univariate relationships. So for each season, I set up 3 different models where the relationship between bats and mega herbivores was direct or mediated entirely through vegetation productivity, or had both those direct and indirect relationships between mega herbivores and bats. And I then use maximum likelihood framework to then compare AIC model and then selected models using AIC comparisons to select the best model for each season. So during the dry season, that direct and indirect relationships model tended to be the best model. What you're seeing here are partial regression coefficients with R-squared values representing the amount of variation by explained for each variable up until that point in the model. And so what you can see is for bat species richness, what the most supportive pathway was an indirect relationship with mega herbivores, where mega herbivores and vegetation productivity had a positive relationship. This could either be due to mega herbivores trimming vegetation in a way that stimulated growth, or mega herbivores actually clustering in areas where there's greener vegetation. And then that in turn had a positive effect on bat species richness, which is what we would predict in the sense that insect abundance tends to increase with a higher NDVI. And so this relationship is probably reflecting that. However, it may be also reflecting the differences that mega-herbivores create in the 3D structure of plant communities, allowing less maneuverable bat species to access sites. On the other side here, the bat activity, so the number of calls I recorded in a night, was directly related with mega-herbivore use. And this was kind of suggesting to me that mega-herbivores themselves may be supporting higher insect densities in the sense of biting flies or something. However, also the presence of dung may be beneficial for insects in a certain way, which may be promoting more bat activity. And these gray lines here, sorry, I should have mentioned earlier, represent insignificant partial regressions coefficients. During the wet season, we did not find any model that supported significant relationships between mega-herbivores and bat communities. And this was somewhat unsurprising to me in the sense that having these running rivers and rainfall in the landscape releases animals from their need to concentrate around permanent bodies of water. And bats may be tracking highly ephemeral insect resources in this area. As is pictured here, this is a Roberts flat-headed bat that was feeding over a river the night before. So this is dried mud caked on his nose that I then kindly peeled off. And mega-herbivores may be searching out for different areas where there's greener or fresher vegetation growth. And so this may cause a disconnect in the spatial distributions of bats and mega-herbivores. So to quickly wrap up this work, I found that the conservation of mega-herbivores, particularly in the dry season in this landscape, may actually promote bat conservation and biodiversity. And given that we know very little about bats, but already act to conserve mega-herbivores in this landscape, this is quite a good finding. In more mesic environments, savanna ecosystems, it's found that the densities of mega-herbivores can be high enough that they negatively impact insectivores like bird communities. And so it's perhaps in these desert systems where densities are lower that they're able to actually benefit these smaller, less studied insectivores. However, the conservation of these large mammals is not going to always come without conflict for the people living in these environments. And so I lastly focused on how are people interacting with wildlife in this landscape. This area is dominated by pastoralist communities on communal conservancies, which are demarcated land areas collectively managed by a group of land residents who agree to conserve and share their natural resources in a way that's sustainable and economically beneficial. This area included people of 4 different ethnic groups: the Herero and Himba, pictured in the center there, Damara, and Remvasmakers. And I'm only going to focus on a portion of this work, but this is recently published among Joel and Tara in the audience here in Conservation Science and Practice, and happy to talk about it later. So I conducted a series of semi-structured interviews for this part of my research with focus on both individuals and focal groups to increase the representation of women in my sampling. And then compared our findings with annual reports of conflict with species that were collected by game guards in the region and wildlife population estimates. And these are provided publicly through the Namibian Association of Community-Based Natural Resource Management Support Organizations. So the data that I'm presenting here are data that were collected by game guards in this region. You're looking at 5 of the top conflict species in this area: cheetah, hyena, leopard, and lion across 3 different conservancies with the number of conflicts per year for each species recorded. And what you can see is that among these different conservancies, there are differences in the number of conflicts, and the offending species also tends to differ. However, cheetah and hyena, some of the smaller bodied species tend to be, cheetah being smaller bodied, hyena somewhat larger, are more represented. However, during our semi-structured interviews, when I asked which wild animals, if any, do you think should not be conserved or protected, we found that the vast majority of our respondents or in interviews reported that they would protect all species. And this was not surprising under the communal conservancy framework. They're supposed to be protecting wildlife. However, when people did report a species that they would choose not to conserve, it tended to most often be lions. And so while these species aren't causing the highest number of conflicts each year, lions are the largest predators in this system and may be having larger effects on both human safety and livestock safety in this system, where one conflict may be killing many livestock and having greater economic effects. To wrap up the semi-structured interviews, I asked 2 open-ended questions. In general, what challenges do you face while living in this area, and what, if anything, do you think could or should be done to address these challenges? And I found that predators killing livestock were by far the most commonly reported problem in this landscape. Many people also recognize that drought is a real problem, and to a lesser extent, elephants destroying crops and water structures. And this tended to be reported more in the southernmost conservancy, where people kept these very small-scaled, like half the size of this room, farm plots or garden plots. The solutions that people recommended were much more variable, and the top solutions almost always addressed predators killing livestock. People suggested that we either harvest or increase the number of trophy hunts of predators in the system. I should mention that trophy hunting and game hunting is legal in Namibia. They also suggested translocating wildlife, particularly predators and elephants, to parks or private farms to reduce their populations in the conservancies, or fencing predators within areas on the conservancies as a way that also promoted the continued growth of ecotourism in this area that may benefit conservancies in the long run. And so by asking these 2 open-ended questions, we were able to not only assess what are the largest problems that people are facing in this area, but where are the areas where conservation opportunities lie. These solutions that are suggested here are likely to be the most supported solutions by people in this landscape. And by removing all predators, if we were to do that, you'd probably be upsetting many of the people here who value seeing these wildlife and value having them for many years to come for future generations to also see. And so they suggest management interventions, but do not want the total removal of predators in the system. As I mentioned before, we're also interested in how do seasonal differences play out in the system. And for the most part, conflicts with humans, which we had represented as conflicts with livestock, threats to human safety, the destruction of crops and water structures, tend to be less intense in the wet season when resources are more readily available than in dry seasons, or particularly in drought years, when both ungulate prey populations are are quite depressed, as well as water resources, which may be affecting the amounts of interactions with elephants on this landscape. So to wrap up this piece of the work, I find it's really important that we understand both the social and ecological factors that are being faced by both people and wildlife on this landscape, how this may be affecting both species distributions and human distributions, and the types of interactions in this environment. And this allows us to figure out where these conservation opportunities really lie, and hopes of moving forward with management interventions. I should point out that these data have not been sent off to the Conservancy offices. However, that's a goal that I have now that the talk is over. And I hope that many of these people will be able to look at this and see how are there similarities and differences across these landscapes. So to wrap things up, I was interested in how water really acts to structure people and wildlife on this landscape as an abiotic factor, and found that water quality may be affecting particular bat species, but not the entire bat community. I was also interested in how do some of these large herbivores affect bat communities, and found, particularly in the dry season, that there are some relationships that seem to be positive between bats and elephants, rhinos, and giraffe. And then lastly, I was interested in how do people perceive some of these large mammals that they live among, and are they willing to support the conservation of these animals in the long term? And as I mentioned before, I was really interested in this project because of the mega herbivore community that's found on this landscape. We know that originally there were many more wild animals in terms of the biomass of vertebrate land animals compared to humans, and that this is now dominated by livestock and humans. And as humans expanded across the world, we know that they also have killed off or removed most of the world's largest mammals. And these mega herbivores had been affecting communities across all of our continents except for Antarctica. And we only find them in certain systems today. So working in this desert in Namibia, where human populations are quite low, as are elephant and rhino and giraffe populations, allows us to look at how these species may have been originally affecting the landscape and impacting a whole suite of other animals that are often overlooked in the system. With that, I'd like to thank a lot of people. I'm only going to highlight a few today. Joel, thank you so much for working with me. Kevin, George, and Tara, thank you for bringing me on, particularly when I moved here with a project already in mind. My former committee members at the University of Montana, many people in Namibia helped me in terms of technical and logistical support. Joyce and Kim here at CSU were really great in helping me get everything done. Val was very important in terms of helping me buy a truck that I lived out of in Namibia. Ken, if he's here, housed my current vehicle for a year and a half, and was very supportive of my transfer here. Many people helped with different forms of analysis. The Burger Lab has been always great, and that includes a big suite of other people. The Liba Lab and Reed Lab both allowed me to join in on their meetings when I transferred here, which was quite great, being Joel's only student at the time. All this field work would not have been done without Lena Mushabati, a recently graduated master's student from the University of Namibia, Mallory Davies, who worked with me for 5 months in the field, and Archie Gavusub, who helped me not only locate my sites that I focused on, but also translated my entire suite of interviews. Thanks to my mom and dad and my sister for coming out. Unfortunately, my great uncle Larry, who will be watching this soon, could not make it. And John, thank you so much for all your help. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Sure.
Okay.
If anybody has to go, I know this is not a normal time. You're welcome to leave at any point. Thanks for coming. Franny.
Great, Teresa, thank you. So one of the underlying assumptions when we talk about whether individuals are selecting different areas is that they have some way to ascertain knowledge about the habitat quality. So in this case, it would be that bats know which areas are high quality and poor quality. Do you have a sense for how bats might be synthesizing that information, if they are?
Yeah, so particularly in relation to the water quality work, there's been some really interesting work done in parts of Colorado by Rick Adams over at University of Northern Colorado, who's found that pregnant and lactating bats actually travel really large distances to drink water that's high in calcium. And those females that are not pregnant or lactating tend to drink resources closer. I have no idea how they know this sampling different landscapes. However, the fact that they do it here suggests that there's some sort of benefit that they know of, and that females using the same colony that may not be reproducing will use different resources, suggests that there's some sort of knowledge there. Dominique.
Yeah, on the same vein, is there any indication of not only the water quality attracting the bats, but potentially the prey they eat being attracted to that specific, like is there a specific species focusing on specific types of insects for any reason? I don't know how bats.
So bats, insect-eating bats for the most part are considered to be quite generalist and will eat any kind of insect in the landscape, on the landscape. However, there are groups of species that are thought to be more specialists that focus more on moths or more on beetles. And since I don't have a large enough size of data to analyze how do insects vary across this landscape, I'm not really sure if that was driving those species in particular. However, there's definitely differences in the amount of insects at these different sites. I can tell you just by how many I inhaled at a site. And whether or not I saw presence of aquatic species as well was also a factor. So, Catherine.
This is kind of similar to what these questions were on about the water quality, but I think you said there were 6 species that were only found in natural springs.
Yes.
So, and you didn't find a difference between natural springs and artificial springs in terms of water quality. Are there any other things about natural springs that would make them more attractive? Like, were they less disturbed? Was there more natural vegetation around them too? Are there other factors that might have, affected those 6 species only being found at natural springs?
So the artificial pools that are constructed in this landscape are typically constructed all the same. So the same depth, the same kind of size. There's either above ground tanks or tanks that are flat with the land surface, which also allows rhinos to drink and not just elephants. I think that as these were constructed outside of the river channel, in areas typically further from vegetation, although there was one site that was quite densely vegetated. There's also no vegetation in the water bodies that may be helping to filter the water. I just think there's quite a bit of differences in the sense of size, depth, diversity. There's definitely more variation among natural springs than there are among natural pools, and that may be benefiting why we find more species across these natural springs. Sure.
In places like the western U.S., there's a lot of work that's supported the effects of cattle grazing and riparian systems and how they alter stream flow and erode banks. And I wonder if you have any sense of how grazing in these communities, if they're in natural waterways, how they're affecting these systems and how that might scale up to bats or other organisms.
That's a great question. Thank you. So the river system just north of the ones that I focused on has a pretty intensive cattle use throughout the year. The areas that I focused on have less so, except for the western edges, which are closer to settlements or sometimes in settlements. But it seems that people in these regions tend to take their take their cattle to water and use the same spots. They do have some troughs in the area that they will not keep full of water, and so in those areas where there's more constructed water around human settlements, they'll accommodate for livestock, but not always for wildlife using those. It would be very interesting to look at. However, the density of livestock using these regions was pretty low, and so I don't think they're having the same sort of effects that they do see in the Southwest here. Anyone else?
I'll conclude with an observation and a comment. The PhD thesis represents an independent scholarly body of work, and certainly Teresa talked about that today. But one doesn't work in isolation, and what Teresa has compiled has been built on the back of others. Many of you in this room have helped contribute. So not just FWCB and not just the ecology program, but CSU. And I think I just want to remind all of us that even though it is a person's contribution, all of us functionally have a vested interest in this. And so thank you guys. Thank Teresa.
Thank you.